Can you just expand on your thoughts here? I found it interesting that you chose to kind of delve into the title, this label of being the only democracy in the Middle East.
Well, the message is a book about writing, and it's a book about words and how writing is deployed. And there are two parts to that tagline. There is the democracy part, and then there's the Middle East part. And it was quickly clear that Israel's not a democracy. Um, like that was just immediately obvious. You know what I mean? Like you tell me you got one set of laws for half the population and everybody else abides by a varying set of laws, like according to what tier they're on. That's just not a democracy. You can't wipe out half the population, or you can't elevate half the population as citizens over everybody else and then call yourself. That's bullshit. You just can't do that. So that was immediately not credible. Perhaps the more interesting part of it was the Middle East part, though. Because the Middle East part, what is in that is the only democracy in the Middle East. There's a silent contrast in that. That
Justification.
I guess is
yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it originates from only, as you know what I mean, because the idea is that these other people don't have it. And what do we hear when we hear Middle East? Like, what do we like? Why does it matter that it's in the Middle East? Like what are we hearing when we hear that? And what we are conjuring is all of the stereotypes and all the ideas and all the dehumanizing ideas, that we have from people in that quote part of the world, end quote. And it justifies so much. It justifies the violence. Well, the only language they understand is why we got to do X, Y, and Z. We're surrounded by people who want to kill us, exterminate us, and we're fighting for a democracy. And the Herzl part that you bring in there is just this idea that was always there. Where he says, we'll be an outpost for, and I'm sorry if I'm not quoting this exactly, but we will be an outpost for civilization, and what is essentially a barbarous part of the world. You see, that's very, very familiar to me because that's the language that was used to justify enslavement. That's exactly, we're going to bring civilization to these people. We're going to bring them over. We're going to teach them Christianity. We're going to make them into, civilized, people. And that, like, you start to see, oh, okay. And then you realize that America itself calls itself the oldest democracy in the world.
Oldest, yes.
The oldest. But you know that you come from an ethnic group that was eliminated from that idea well within the lifetime of your parents. And you start to see the pairing in that. You start to see how these two things are actually working together in such a way that they're parcels of the same system. The branding is so important. Because you say these things, admit Israel has a right to exist. Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel is the only democracy. And you say it so much, and powerful people say it so much that the mind cuts off.
Sticks.
And you stop thinking about, what are you actually saying here? What are you really saying here? And you don't interrogate it. The right to exist question, for instance, which I think is just like, we should spend a lot more time talking about that. States are not people. States are not holy. States are tools. States are tools, and hopefully they are tools to allow human beings and human life to prosper, as much human life as possible. And when a state is not doing that job, it deserves scrutiny. My screwdriver does not, I'm not concerned with the rights of my screwdriver to exist, of my hammer to exist. I'm concerned with whether it does the job, man. And so is the state doing the job that well-meaning and well-thinking and good people think it should do? That's the question.
What I'm thinking about right now is that on this whole thing about justification is that when it comes to your critics and those who you engage in debate with or pro-Israel or want to defend Israel, it's that you're basically taking away a key tool from the argument, which is the justification. You say, I'm against apartheid, period. I don't want to hear any kind of justification. There is no because.
There's no because.
And then I think that's what's causing such an interesting debate with you right now.
Yeah.
Is that you're just taking that out. You're taking that tool out of the equation.
No, there's no because. There's no because. And if you think there is a because, that tells me a lot about you. And the reason why it tells me a lot about you is because there was always a because for slavery. There was always a because for Jim Crow. there was always a because for colonization, for colonialism. There was always a because. So when you start becauseing, it means that under certain circumstances, you believe apartheid is appropriate. And then I know, now I know who I'm talking to, because I know that under circumstances, you would believe that my segregation was appropriate. You understand? Like you really are no different. You think this is taking you out of the league of colonizers, conquerors, and segregationists and white supremacists. In fact, you sound just like them. And so it's like you have to decide whether you're for or against certain things. I mean, it's the example I use all the time. I'm against the death penalty. I don't care what the dude did or woman did. I just don't care. I am against it. As a child of, and a descendant of enslaved people, I am against enslavement. There's nothing white people could do that could make me say we should enslave them, break up their families, and sell their children. I'm not for it. There's no because. There's no because in my politics around that. And so when you start becauseing apartheid, oh, the Palestinians are so violent. Oh, what about the suicide bombing that happened here? Oh, what about, this? What about that? But it's like, are you for it or against it? Like, do you believe this is an acceptable tool to be used against people or not? And if you think it is acceptable under certain conditions, then I'm against. I'm against you. I'm against that idea. Some things should be wiped out of the toolkit completely.
I want to ask also about your experience as a Black American who's written so much about the Black experience, right, in America. Slavery, segregation, civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. And then you go there and you witness that system, right? You witness the occupation. But you see it as being carried out in your name. Now, what are those thoughts like?
Painful. Deeply, deeply painful. And you start to see like your own privilege and your own power. And I think Black heritage and Black politics is tied up in that. And it's tied up in that because the United States tells a story about itself, which is that it has somehow overcome slavery, it has somehow overcome discrimination, and it has made itself better. And Martin Luther King as its patron saint of the best of America. But we are practicing the thing that we claim that we have overcome. We are practicing it. We are endorsing it. We are funding it somewhere else. So what does that say about who we are? And those of us who are the descendants of people who have suffered under those systems, I believe, have a very, very particular and special responsibility to do something about it. Because the hope is we didn't come out of Jim Crow. We didn't come out of slavery just to be partial to those systems being inflicted on other people.